I don't make baked goods with dates and feel like, oh, this isn't sweet enough. Like, it to me is very sweet, but it also adds moisture and chewiness and a richness and depth that I feel like you can't get with regular sugar.
This is Taste. I'm your host, Matt Rodbard. Today on the show, we have conversations with two very cool authors. First up is Jess Damuck, author of the new cookbook, Health Nut. In this conversation, we chop it up about Jess's pivot away from salads, what she's cooking in her home in LA, and how she brought so much color to the book's recipe development and striking photography. I love the way she shot this book, and we get into the way she captured these images. Also on the show, I have a great conversation with Sarah Franklin. We talk about her new book on legendary cookbook editor Judith Jones and how Jones' influence is felt today in cookbook publishing. I hope you enjoy these really great conversations. Jess Damuck, welcome back to This Is Taste. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm happy to see you. I love your work, and I love Health Nut. It's a really terrific book. We're going to talk about it.
Thank you so much.
You just had your party last night in the city. What was that like? What was the? Because you're usually like doing home entertaining. You're more intimate, but now you did this big party. What was that like?
You know, it was strange in a good way, but definitely strange. I'm usually making dinner for I think 36 people I found is my sweet spot at my house.
Shut up. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
But that usually means, I'm pretty much in the kitchen the entire time.
Yeah.
Like, I pop out, make sure everybody's doing well. I had a party at my house for the book, and I popped out for a second, gave a little talk, and then I was back in the kitchen. So to just be able to actually celebrate and take a minute and not be worried about every little detail and just talk to people about the book was really nice. Rachel Comey hosted it, and it was such a nice, it really felt like a New York City night, which is really nice.
We put Comey in the invite. You definitely, it feels like a New York night.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I like this mission statement. I'm going to quote you. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not a wellness influencer. I'm just a classically trained French chef who has a nostalgia for the sticky shelves of health food stores. I love that. I agree. I have a nostalgia as well. I grew up going to health food stores. I worked in health food stores. I want to get into that. What is your health food store background?
Well, I grew up on Shelter Island, which is a little tiny island off of Long Island. And there's a really amazing health food store in Sag Harbor called Provisions. And I grew up going there. There was a really great playground in Sag Harbor, and my parents would always take me to the health food store to get a treat before going there.
Was carob involved in that treat?
I distinctly remember getting a chocolate rice milk and thinking this is, how could anything be better than this?
I love it.
Yeah. And I also grew up, we traveled to Vermont a lot every fall, went leaf peeping, and the Brattleboro Food Co-op was always a destination. And when I was 14, I started working at this hippie restaurant on Shelter Island called Planet Bliss. And that really, really influenced this book and the way I eat.
Yeah, I mean, health food stores, I think, are obviously the founding and the start of our interest in food for many of us. There's no surprise that Erewhon is so big now. It started as kind of a hippie health food store, and now it's huge. And I worked at the Natural Health Center in Kalamazoo, Michigan for 2 years.
Amazing.
Yeah. When you were young, were there any products that you talked about the rice milk, but were there any other products on those sticky shelves that made you think about food a little more?
I think, I was talking to a lot of people about it at the party yesterday, and there's just sort of this taste of health food.
Yeah.
It's everything, the health food of the 70s and 80s was, everything kind of tasted the same. And I don't know if it was the nutritional yeast or the apple cider vinegar, but all of those things sort of, that's the flavor I'm nostalgic for.
Yeah, the nutritional yeast on everything. I mean, for me, it was sesame sticks and tiger milk bars.
Totally.
That was my health food experience.
I wrote about this in the book, but my parents and I went to the Brattleboro Food Co-op, and I was going to UVM at the time, and I explained to my dad, I'm like, everything's like a little bit slower in Vermont. Like the pace is different. And he's like, no, you just go to New York City too much.
Yeah.
Like it's not. And he went to go get some sesame chews from the bulk bin, and they weren't coming out. They were like wrapped in plastic and kind of jammed. So he was like, started to like shake it to get it out. And this guy came up to him and he was like, hey man, you don't need to shake it. It will come out eventually. And I was like, yeah, see what I mean?
I mean, and then you move to LA and that energy transfers. And I feel like you shop in LA and there's that attitude.
I mean, that's how I am now. So it's fine. I have nothing against that attitude at all.
I mean, LA is deeply rooted in health nut and just photography alone. A lot of natural light. It's really cool the way you bring to life your book. And tell me a little bit about your choices you made with photography, because it is really striking.
It was so fun.
Yeah.
I think originally it was supposed to be a vegetable book. And so many vegetable books come out every season.
Yeah.
And all of them are great for different reasons.
Agreed.
But once I was thinking about this, I was like, no, I moved to LA. I'm so inspired by the food culture here. There's so much amazing history, and there is this obsession with Erewhon and wellness influencers and all of this stuff, but there's also so much history. And I think that's where I really started. Roger Steffens, aka the Family Acid, who took all of the lifestyle photos. I've been a huge fan of his work for a long time. And he takes these really trippy double exposures. And he's been shooting California counterculture since he got back from Vietnam in the 60s. And I thought, this is really important to have his work in this book. It can't be a book about California without these photos for me. And I was so happy to find out that he lived 10 minutes down the road from me and was very excited to come work with us. So I think it made the book really, really special. Linda Pugliese's photography, of course,
for the food is amazing.
Incredible. She's so lovely and so she was so excited to be in LA, and she really soaked in that California light, and you can see it on every page.
Absolutely. You did such a great job of capturing natural light there, but the double exposure imagery for chapter openers and lifestyle shots, there's a little bit of archival in there too, I believe. And I just like the way you have such an editorial take on photography.
Yeah, it was really exciting. I met Isis Aquarian from the Source family. She was the Source family historian, and she was so excited about this book and to be a part of it. And I loved being able to tell her story and learn. I never got to go to the Source restaurant, which was like the first health food restaurant in Los Angeles, and hearing straight from the source, no pun intended, what that was like was incredible. And it's something I was so excited to share with readers.
I mean, you embrace food vibrations in a way that, no eye roll here. I like this line. Whatever energy goes into the food is what comes out of it. And I like the way that you say you take a breath before eating. You remind us. And you do this in a way, it's prescriptive. And I enjoy that. Yeah.
That is really my partner, Ben Sinclair. He always, before he started shooting an episode of High Maintenance, the television show he created, he would always have the whole crew stop and take 10 breaths before they started shooting. And he's brought that into our dinner parties. Like, he just has everyone stop for 10 breaths before we eat. And everyone's always like, oh my gosh, that was so profound. And it's something so simple. And you can roll your eyes and think it's cheesy, but then you can also just do it and realize like, oh, it is nice to appreciate all the effort that's gone into this. I think that's another part of my sort of food philosophy, that it is cool to care. I mean, you can pretend, oh, I just threw this together, or, I got this on the table. But there's so much thought that goes into cooking, from choosing a recipe to getting the ingredients to, it's filled with love. It's filled with care. It's filled with intention. And I think, of course, there are days where we're all exhausted and just want to, get something out there, but you feel that. And if you can put love and good feelings into it, everybody's going
I
to
buy it.
receive that.
Yes, I
Yeah.
buy it. I like it a lot. I like your take. I'm glad you brought up Ben. I'm a big fan of the High Maintenance, and also he's all over the book. So and he's directing Dave as well, which I thought were good
Yeah.
episodes that he did. I think those were
Yeah.
some of the better episodes of that show. Let me ask you about another public figure you're kind of in your world is Martha Stewart. In our last episode, and I'll link to in the show notes, we talked a lot about Martha. I really like this recipe, quote, every single morning, Martha Stewart starts her day with a glass of this green juice and a whole milk cappuccino. Super good pro tip to living a great life. What is in the green juice?
Well, the green juice has spinach and not kale.
Yeah.
And that's very important because the kale can be like super earthy,
Yeah.
but the spinach has a really clean taste. And she likes to have just a few strips of the orange and lemon zest peeled with a Y peeler. You throw that in and then you cut off all of the pith. So that way you're getting
Yeah.
that bright flavor, but you're not getting the bitterness. And then a whole bunch of parsley, celery, a green apple,
Yeah.
ginger. It's really the perfectly balanced green juice. It's so delicious.
Yeah, it's in the book Ovs, and we're gonna link to buying this book in the show notes. I really like the book. The recipe writing is really strong, and I mean the whole milk cappuccino too. Come on, no dairy substitutes here from Martha.
No. Yeah, and she's really right about everything. It's it's just true. It never ceases to amaze me. But
Yeah.
if she says something, like, I'm buying it for sure.
How has your relationship with Martha evolved over the past 4 or 5 years since you moved to California?
It's really incredible. I actually watched the unauthorized documentary. It's a 4-part series. I was watching it with Ben and I was really quiet, sort of sinking down into my chair. And he's like, "Are you okay? What's going on with you?" And I was like, "No, I'm swelling with emotion." I was like, this is so crazy. I was middle schooler living on this tiny island with 20 kids in my class. I'm an only child. My parents really don't watch TV or have any sort of reference to pop culture or anything. And I discovered Martha Stewart living at the grocery store. And from the second I saw it, I wanted to be like Martha. I was throwing dinner parties for my friends and dreaming of this sort of life you could have. And to now be able to sit across from this person I idolized and call them a friend is beyond what I could ever imagine. And I'm so grateful for her support and her encouragement. And just how often do you meet your idol and you're not disappointed at all? You're just continuously amazed.
We're working on our 100th book here, so I know that's
know.
underway. I actually was in the Lightroom yesterday, and I saw some photos from it. It looked great. When you say you sunk into the chair, I'm back to that. What do you mean? I mean, this is an unauthorized 4-part doc. I mean, are they saying things that aren't true? Is it just more about the gravity, how big she was, especially in the 90s? Actually, she's bigger now than ever.
I mean,
that's clear. But
just
90s
watching everything she's accomplished.
Yeah, I got it.
I know the story so well, but just seeing it all play out, I'm just always so floored by it. She's just achieved so much. She's paved the way for every woman in the food industry, and this specifically food media.
Yeah.
And she does it with such elegance and grace, and she's so cool.
Yeah, she's cool. and she owns the rails too. She actually owns her own, she owns a magazine, a network. I mean, she owned everything. It was very smart the way she positioned her career in media.
Yeah,
really
absolutely.
Smart.
And she really changed the way women were viewed in the food world.
Yes.
She made working in the home and all aspects of that, not just food, but gardening and decorating the table and celebrating holidays, all of the stuff that at the moment she was doing, it was considered to be sort of like a trap of domesticity, was suddenly cool. And I mean, that's amazing.
Back to the book. Why does this combo work? Tuna, avocado, and grapefruit.
Well, it's not just because Martha says it does, which is
Right,
why
right,
I
right,
made
right,
it.
right. You have a great recipe for a combination of those three.
Yeah, it's a textural thing.
Yeah.
It's the brightness from the grapefruit. It's the texture of the avocado, the richness of that with the oils from the fish. It's just the perfect bite. And I will tell you, I had a friend of mine like misunderstand it and blend it all together,
Oh,
and that does not work.
wait,
So
wait. Yeah. So explain the recipe. And I'm sorry, your friend did
yeah.
not. I don't know what your friend was thinking.
Well, Ben described what it was to this person, and they just like mashed everything together and then served it on crackers. And I was like, oh no, this is
Oh,
definitely, it works because of the
like a
textures.
California roll. I got it.
Yeah.
Like they were doing the California roll. No, you need to slice.
Yes.
Yeah, it's slicing. So it's the three of them together in like a salad or poke type bowl.
I like to just eat it on top of like a seeded cracker.
Yeah.
Just like assemble it and eat it bite by bite. And it's perfect.
Your tahini French toast photo is great.
Thank you.
My favorite photo I've seen in a cookbook, and I mean that legitimately. It was really styled perfectly. Love
Thank
that.
you.
And it's really evocative. Let's talk about that recipe.
That recipe is inspired by my friend Yanu came back from Greece, and truly all he could eat every day for months was toast covered in tahini and honey. And it's not, he wasn't stingy with it. It wasn't just a little drizzle. It was like drowning in tahini and honey.
Yeah.
And I love that. It's just like feels so decadent and so, oh, it's so yummy.
Yeah.
And that this recipe was inspired by that, but really taking it one level further by making it a sesame crusted French toast. And yeah, I think it's just so visually striking. It's like slathered in tahini, and then it gets this zigzag drizzle from the honey. And we found my friend Jonathan Pessin has this amazing prop collection called Not for Sale in LA. And I was looking for surfaces, and I saw this plywood table, and the wood grain looked to me exactly like the tahini toast. And so I put it in my van, and we took the picture, and it was perfect.
So perfect. Such a great image. I get a sense just talking to you about this book and just the way you entertain. It makes me think that there could be a restaurant in your future. And I look at the LA restaurant Stir Crazy. I was talking to Harley, one of the owners, and I'm not sure if you've been there, but that guy is like an art world guy and a music industry guy, and he's just like knows how to throw a dinner party and actually has one of the cooler restaurants in LA right now in terms of the attitude and vibe. And I feel like, do you want to open a restaurant? Do you go to Stir Crazy at all, by the way?
I have been there, but only for wine. I need to have the food.
Food's amazing.
Because everyone has
really
said
good.
It's incredible. But the truth is, I've barely left my house for the past year.
You did 2 cookbooks in,
a year. Ben, my partner, also, while I was writing this book, was working on this experimental spiritual community sort of TV project.
Okay.
And so there was a lot going on this year. Feeding people is the best part of cooking, seeing people's reactions and just bringing people together. And right now it's definitely been a lot of big dinner parties, but I have an open mind.
You haven't thought. You've thought, but you haven't decided to go pro in that way.
It's hard to know what's next. Like I got a kiln over the summer, and I made all the plates for my last dinner party I threw, and I was like, I could just take some time to make some lumpy sculptures. I don't know.
Yeah. Food is not your only interest. This Ben project sounds like Nathan Fielder shit. What's going on there? You said a cult? It's creating a cult?
It's a spiritual community.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Like
I'm using a very crass term and my terms and yours, but
it was really, really fun to have a lot of actors and artists and different people around our house. And
cool.
I think Ben and I have really been able to inspire each other in a lot of different ways and encourage each other. And it's been really, really fun.
Yeah, it's still one of the best shows of the last 25 years easily. I think many will agree who actually watched the show. Who's Todd from the Green Toddess, by the way? Great name. Green Toddess dressing.
Everyone's like, there's a typo. And I was like, no,
guys.
What is my friend Todd Thomas is truly just a one of a kind, the most special person I know. He has lived in New York in Soho since the early 70s. He is a tailor and seamstress and incredible fashion designer. And yeah, there's truly no one like him. And he was part of this spiritual community project. He's been a really longtime friend of Ben's. And I made this potato salad for a celebration during the filming of this show, and he was like, I had already finished the book. Like
Yeah.
it was, the manuscript had been submitted, it had been shot, and he's like, no, he has this. I can't even do his voice justice, but he was like, you've got to put this in that book, and so it was in.
You just painted the perfect downtown New York picture for me.
Yeah.
So you got some acting chops there, Jess. Let's see in front of the camera.
You're going to.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
You're in the show.
I don't know when, but
you're in the show. Okay, yeah. Obviously. So what is the green Tadas potato salad? Because I'm like, I like the recipe too. It wasn't just a fun name. What's in it?
It's just a really simple, like traditional potato salad, except made with a buttermilk based green goddess dressing.
Oh, cool. Buttermilk's the root of that. Great.
Yeah. So it has that nice tang, that brightness. There's lots of lemon zest in it. It's nice and green.
It's a good reminder. There's like these like precious articles about, keep the buttermilk on hand but like literally you should do that. It's great advice. And like buttermilk, not just as a meat marinade, but like to have around is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Just to play around with having. So you should buy some buttermilk and mess around.
And they make it in smaller containers now, which I think is really nice.
I know they used to be in the quarts and it's
like,
yo guys, like I don't want this.
Yeah, now you can get a little guy, which I think is
the little guys. I feel milk should get smaller and smaller.
Yeah.
Like even 4 ounces, I would say, for like coffee. Like all I want is 4 ounces.
There's a recipe for nut milk in the book, and I'm really trying to convince as many people as I can that it's worth it to make their own nut milk.
Yeah.
It's not that hard. It sounds like it would be like so much work, but it's so delicious and it's so much less expensive.
Is it cost prohibitive? So you said the opposite. I'm thinking I'm going to be buying all these nuts.
I just get a big thing of almonds from Trader Joe's.
Yeah.
And it makes so much nut milk and it tastes so much better and it foams perfectly in my latte every morning. I really think it's worth it.
I'm into that. Okay, I want to segue and talk about the Sprout sandwich. I love a Sprout sandwich, and we all have our, I think, opinions and takes on what makes a good Sprout sandwich. For you, Jess, what makes it work with Sprouts?
Well, I really love Sprouts, so I eat them on pretty much everything. I put them on my egg sandwiches in the morning. I roll them into wraps. But, it's funny. There's a Sprout sandwich in the book I wrote with Benny, and there's a Sprout sandwich in my book, and I had to make them feel different. And there are so many different ways you can go. Benny's is, no surprise, fully loaded.
Yeah.
It's like cheddar cheese, 2 different types of pickles. What else is on there? You make like a Dijonnaise and
nice
avocado. It's on a thick slice of sourdough bread, so it's like a full.
That's an avo melt. I'm hearing.
Oh, it's not melted.
It's not hot though.
It's not hot.
Cold. Okay.
Yeah.
Word. Okay. Gotcha.
It's so good.
Sounds good.
But it's also almost, you have to sort of unhinge your jaw and then it comes like squeezing out the back, which is fine. But I went for like one that was inspired by the one that was served at the Source restaurant, a much more classic, like comes together in 3 seconds. Raw red onion, just really, really thinly sliced. Yeah.
Got to be careful with those for some people.
Definitely.
They don't love it, but when you put the perfect thin slice of raw red,
just a little tiny bit, and you can always soak it in cold water and take that bite out of it. Yeah, I love it. I think they feel so fresh and so healthy, and I love the texture. They're so good for you. You have to remember to wash them. Yeah. But
you gotta watch them. Watch your Sprouts. Also, like, let's be clear, Sprouts don't have to be the standard alfalfa Sprouts. Like,
I love broccoli
Sprouts. Man, go to your local any store. Pretty much, you're gonna find some Sprouts there.
Yeah.
Go to your farmer's market and look for Sprouts. That's the best.
And they are another really easy thing to make yourself. I'm not a super like I'll go on a kick for a little while and have a jar going all the time, and then you know, forget about it. But it is, if you want to do it at home, it is
It's a
very
fun
easy.
project. Good call, Jess. All right. A couple other ideas and questions and topics about the book. Why are there so many dates in the book? You mentioned this, and I agree. I like page through. I saw a dozen references to dates, and I was just at a trade show in California at Expo West, and I saw like a lot of date bars. You see them in recipes. Why are they so popular for you?
I moved to Los Angeles, and it was like experiencing a date for the first time.
Yeah.
At the farmer's market, the dates are so soft and they truly taste like candy. And they really just blew my mind. And I think that they're such a wonderful alternative to processed sugar. The flavor is so rich. It has that wonderful caramelly,
Mm-hmm.
and it is so sweet. It's not, I don't make baked goods with dates and feel like, oh, this isn't sweet enough. Like it to me is very sweet, but it also adds moisture and chewiness and a richness and depth that I feel like you can't get with regular sugar.
Yeah.
And I love them, especially just like the like nut butter filled chocolate covered dates. I just keep them in the freezer all the time, and they really taste exactly like Snickers bars,
Oh
but
yeah.
better.
But way better. I mean,
Yeah.
the good nut butter, absolutely. And how are you buying dates just at the farmer's market?
Also, Rancho Meladuca is a
Good.
wonderful brand
Yeah.
that sells nationwide. Julie's are another
Yeah.
California-based brand. I think if you just take a little extra effort, they are, of course, like a little pricier. But once you taste one of these super soft, delicious dates, I don't know, they're kind of mind-blowing.
Let's talk about what's next for you. You mentioned Benny, and that's Benny Blanco. He has a book out with you. You're co-authoring it with him. But what's new? What's next?
There, I do hope I can take a little pause, but I
Yeah.
think the key word there is little.
Yeah.
I was really the second Salad Freak came out, I started working on the book with Benny,
Yeah.
and I really didn't get really a minute to like wrap my head around what I had just done or celebrate it or even like be proud of this accomplishment before I moved on to the next thing. And then, when I knew I was sort of wrapping up with that, I signed another book deal for myself, and that's Help Nut.
Yeah.
So it's been really nonstop. And there was something great about that because I think your second book or sophomore project of any kind is always like, okay, maybe there were no expectations with the first book, but now you've set yourself up for
Yeah.
something, and people are looking at you now, and they're waiting for something. And what are you going to do?
Mm-hmm.
And I think if I had had too much time to sit in that space, that's not good for me. I have to, if I'm going to work off instinct, I have to have a tight deadline.
Agree. I'm the same way. It's really well said. You have
Yeah.
to definitely like just do the work.
Yeah.
You can't think about it too much. Yeah.
And like I said, this was originally supposed to be a vegetable book called Veggie Freak. And I started writing it and I was like, no, like I'm sitting on my porch, like watching the sunset every night and eating grain bowls after I
Yeah.
come home from developing Benny's like fried chicken recipes. And this is the food that feels really good to me right now. And it's what I crave. And I don't see a lot of health food books on the shelves. I went up to Omnivore Books in San Francisco, which is an amazing
Shout
little
out to Celia. I
cookbook.
love that bookstore.
Yeah.
Doing an event there.
It's so
Like-
great.
Yeah.
And, she said, look at like the shelf. There's like 1 million vegetable books, but there's no health food books.
And that's in San Francisco.
Yeah.
Like, LA's got its moments with the source, but man, we're talking about San Francisco
Yeah.
proper. Ground zero for
And-
health nut.
And then she sort of like shifted me over and she's like, but check out the vintage cookbook section.
Yeah.
She's like, look at all these books. And my vintage cookbook collection expanded by, I have this amazing collection from the 70s now. And what they were doing back then was so groundbreaking. And it was, looking at some of these books where it's like you have to mail order your tofu because it wasn't available
crazy
in
to think about.
stores. Now we have access to incredible ingredients. pretty much everywhere. And that was important to me as well. There's so many really precious books about produce. And I would even consider Salad Freak to be that a little bit.
Yeah.
But, I really wanted this to feel accessible. And there are a couple ingredients in there. Like, I'm obsessed with this smoked soy sauce, which you can buy on Amazon, but it's a little bit of a
What's the
fussy
brand?
ingredient. I forget,
Yeah.
which is bad.
Okay.
But it's this cute little bottle.
Yeah.
But that's also something you can use regular soy sauce and sprinkle some smoked paprika in it. And I say that in the book. And I really try to make everything like, if you're going to a grocery store anywhere, and you try to get to the organic section if that's accessible for you, or if not, like, hopefully you can still put this together. Like, I really love Rancho Gordo beans, but I can't get it together to soak them like 3/4 of the time.
Yeah.
So I
A
always
lot of
have
debate
canned
about
beans.
to soak or not soak Rancho
And
Gordo.
sometimes I just can't, like, I don't think of what I want to eat until a half hour before
Yeah.
I'm starving. So, I always keep canned beans on hand. There's packaged greens in my fridge very often, and I'm not a hater. I think whatever we can do to feed ourselves well, if you're making that effort, it goes a really long way.
On This Is Taste, we ask guests about their discerning taste. So to close this interview, here's a little rapid fire Fast and Furious taste check. Jess, are you ready?
I think so, yeah.
The best fruit?
Oro Blanco grapefruit.
Okay, let's dig into that. What is that? What does that mean? I don't know those words. I know grapefruit.
Oro Blancos are white grapefruits.
Oh, okay.
To me, there's no better taste than that maybe in the world. It's my favorite flavor.
I love it. This question is so fascinating because we get so many variety of answers. We've never had a white grapefruit answered.
I love it.
I love it. And so we're going to do the flip. What's the worst vegetable?
I like how sunchokes taste, but I'm not sure the human body is meant to process sunchokes. And I actually took a sunchoke recipe out of the book because I was like, why am I forcing people to eat these? I don't think I've never met anybody who has an easy time after eating a bunch of sunchokes.
Yeah, bro. Yeah, you got to cook them like to death if you're going to avoid that after effect. The best dessert.
Best dessert. I can't go through a day without eating dark chocolate. So I don't know if that's the best thing, but it's the thing I can't live without. I also love strawberry, rhubarb, and ginger as a combination in any way possible.
It's amazing. Favorite American fast food chain?
In-N-Out.
Your West Coast life now. Aren't
Yeah.
you? We didn't talk about road trips. That van looks pretty cool, 1990.
The van is amazing, and part of every road trip is going to In-N-Out.
Was that the van in high maintenance? Was that the actual van?
No, he got another one when he moved to LA, and it's so fun. It's the best thing.
It's got a great little cameo in the book. And I like the way you write the book with the vignettes because you have a fun little way with the essay writing.
Thank you.
Very cool. All right. I want to talk about New York City restaurants. Do you have a couple favorites that you just come to when you come back to town, when you're doing events or just visiting?
Yes. Four Horsemen has been my favorite for a long time. And I don't know, I feel like this isn't throwing shade to anyone, but I feel like almost every new restaurant I've tried seems like they've gotten a lot of inspiration from Four Horsemen. So
in the wine bar category, of course.
But the food also seems to
Yeah.
be really inspired by what they've been doing for a few years. So I really try to go to the original.
It's a great, Nick Crotola is an amazing chef.
He really is.
Super great chef. What a couple more. Give me a few more New York spots that you come back to. I like to hear New Yorkers who leave and then come back. Where are you going to first, like on this tour when you came to town?
Roman's was my neighborhood spot, and it has the best feeling, and it's something I really miss when I'm in LA. That feeling of walking in off the sidewalk and being warm and cozy and knowing almost everybody there somehow, and being treated like a regular is always
not as common in LA.
Really nice. It's a different experience because you have to drive there. And I think that changes a lot of it.
I get it.
Getting people to get on board to make a reservation and actually arrive there when you want them to is also much harder in LA. There's no sort of like, hey, what's up tonight? And strolling into a place. Where I love Hearts, also old neighborhood spot. I'm going to be going to Dimes tonight, another one of my favorites, and they're making a few dishes from the book, which is really exciting. Great. Yeah, and I don't know. I've been less and less into restaurants. I think it's just because I've been
You've been
trapped at
busy.
home developing
When you're
recipes.
so in LA, the next question is like the LA answer. When you're not working, what are some of the go-tos?
Found Oyster is the best spot to
Yeah.
hang. I think they've done such a good job there. I love Bavel and Safi's, and there's, Via's Tacos is in my neighborhood, an amazing taco spot. And the truth is, I eat a lot of Erewhon.
Yeah.
I really do.
You don't have to lower your voice.
I had
You
to. I
can
feel
say
like I
you can say
had
it fully throated in this
to
podcast.
mumble it. I miss it while I'm here in New York.
It's a fun place to just to hang out. I mean, not the one in Beverly Hills, which I found myself in recently just because of a work thing, and I will not go there again. But the one in Calabasas, the one in Silver Lake. Do you have a favorite location?
There's a new one in Pasadena, which
I've
is
heard.
the closest to where I live.
I've heard it's nice.
It's nice. There's good people watching. You'd be surprised who lives in Pasadena. Yeah.
So, I mean, not surprised. I mean, up and north of Pasadena, a lot of people live
It's
there.
really, it's fun.
Yeah.
I don't know. I like sitting outside and eating
It's
there.
Venice as a vibe too. If you catch,
Oh, yeah.
if you're like hang out outside the Venice location,
The Studio City one also is a great one for people watching.
I have not been to that one.
If you want to do some celeb sightings,
yeah,
that's the
Studio
place
City
to
is
go.
where it's at. Good call. Good tips. Erewhon cookbook.
I hear they're working on it.
They
I
are?
don't know.
I
I
love
know.
it.
Yeah. I mean, it's great. Their stuff is great.
It's great. They have great taste. They have great. They really do support independent producers and makers. And I know not just from the buying of stuff, but the signal boosting of these young brands.
Yeah.
And just being in Erewhon is a moment, and it's cool. Really cool.
They've really made health food really cool. You know?
Yeah, totally. Your favorite cookbook of all time?
Martha Stewart Entertaining.
Iconic cover. First,
it's the best.
looks great.
It's the best book ever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think Anna Heasel, the former co-host of the show, will agree with you on that one fully, I believe. And with the Martha books, I mean, the art in them is amazing. Like the art meaning the photography. Like it is really something.
That book was really one of the first books to have full color photography for almost everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a classic.
Breakout hit for her. A few more. Favorite recent cookbook discovery?
While I was cooking this book, developing these cookbooks, Molly Baz's new book has been a great one for just like, hey, I know this recipe is going to work. I'm going to have it done in probably 30 minutes. And Ben has even cooked from it, which is really, really nice. I like to say, like, when the B team can cook from a book, it's
nice.
Great. It's really
great.
good.
The B team. That's
Yeah.
funny way to put it. Smart. Yeah, it's definitely like when it's the B team of your household, the B cook. Does he cook for you at all?
He's very, very good at breakfast.
Best.
But dinner can be sort of overwhelming. And there was definitely a point in working on these books where I was like, if you ask me what's for dinner, like, you better watch out.
Yeah.
Like,
What?
but
I just made like 16 versions of risotto, and fucking that's what we're having.
Yeah.
My guy, we're having risotto. A few more cuisine you would like to learn more about.
Actually, I'm very interested in Korean food.
Yeah.
One of my best friends and my studio mate was born in Korea, and he's there right now for his first time ever.
Oh my God. Amazing.
Well, not first time ever, but first time since being adopted. And watching his journey has been really exciting. And I think there's just so many flavors that are so interesting, and it's just a whole new world for me. So yeah, I'm excited to check out your book.
Right on, yeah. And last one, your favorite sandwich?
I think it's a veggie sandwich with sprouts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's on brand.
California sandwich.
California. And so what's the condiment? We didn't get into that part.
I did a lemony sort of dressing, creamy dressing on mine. I think the Dijonnaise is also really good. It needs to have a brightness or a bite to it.
Yeah, not just straight like Hellman's.
No, I don't think so. You need to have a little something going on there.
Yeah, because there isn't a lot. I mean, it's like vegetable essentially.
Yeah. And there needs to be a protective barrier, against the bread, or it's gonna get soggy, which is unfortunate.
Jess Damuck, thank you so much for joining This Is Takes.
Thank you.
Sarah Franklin, welcome to This Is Taste. How are you?
I'm well today. Thanks so much for having me, Matt.
Let's talk about Judith Jones. I want to start by asking you simply, Judith Jones wasn't just a legend in our industry, in food writing, but really was somebody who, quote unquote, shaped culture in America, which is the subtitle of your book. Let's set up the Judith Jones shaping culture in America.
Yes, you're talking about a woman who was born in 1924 here in Manhattan and a white woman of a great deal of privilege, so important to position her that way, but was not particularly excited about the idea that womanhood laid out for her in that generation. From an early age, she was interested in stories and food. Her dad was sort of a bon vivant and would sneak her out to little French restaurants in the neighborhood and then get wrist slapped by his wife, who was very sort of buttoned up, waspy New Englander. And she was really interested in exploring stories and pleasure. And she went off to college in the late 1930s, early 40s, right into World War II. And because a lot of men were off at war in the 40s, she was offered an internship at Doubleday when she was in college at Bennington. That's how she got her foot in the door in publishing. And she really began to understand that the way that stories get told and that stories shape culture is by editors doing what they do, is by both anticipating and reflecting shifts in culture.
Yeah. I mean, an editor's job is absolutely to reflect the change, the delta happening in real time. It's not about what happened 6 years ago. It's what's happening 6 minutes ago.
That's right. And then you're talking before television and the internet. And so books had different kinds of power in terms of how they shifted culture. So in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, which is when she really started in earnest as an editor, she's shaping culture in addition to publishing books that are reflecting what's going on in the larger culture. Yeah. She was Sylvia Plath's first American editor. She published The Colossus, which was her first collection of poetry. She actually passed on the bell jar. There's a whole story there. But she was working with, at the time, greats like John Hersey, Elizabeth Bowen, her lover, and then someone she edited was the poet Theodore Roethke. Really, really big names in the literary world. She went on to be John Updike's editor for his entire career, Ann Tyler's editor for her entire career, poetry throughout her career. So food was one of several things that she did. But it was also really reflective of, she wanted to see women position themselves differently in American culture and also to celebrate what went on at home on a daily basis, which she thought was worth talking and writing and reading about.
It's amazing when you set it up as having this like dual kind of mindset with publishing fiction, publishing nonfiction, publishing lifestyle, publishing heavy nonfiction, including the Diary of Anne Frank, and we'll get into the mythology around that. And you have new reporting about the discovery of that manuscript, which she did. But I just want to get a sense, Sarah, you have dedicated a lot of time to writing about Judith Jones. Why pick her out of everybody you could have spent this time as an academic reporting on and learning about?
Yeah, I was in my first semester of graduate school and I was just about ready to drop out. I was bored to tears. Frankly, I don't like writing that way.
Neither do I. And it's just the worst.
It's the worst.
Yeah,
it's dry.
It's so bad.
It's not what I wanted to do, but I needed a job and it felt like a pathway to, I love teaching. Anyway, that's sort of another thing. But I was taking a class up at the Columbia Center for Oral History, and they regularly get calls from all kinds of people who are like, how do we do an oral history of person X, right? They're kind of a clearinghouse for that kind of knowledge. And my professor, I was always the food person in a non-food room, because if you're a food person in academia, everyone's like, you study what? I'm sorry, that's not serious
Wait,
stuff.
Still today? People
oh my
think that
God,
way?
you would not believe the condescension.
That's hilarious.
Oh, I mean, it's just pervasive. It's everywhere.
Tisk
That's
academics.
Right. That's
Get a
right.
life.
So I'm up at Columbia, and everything is it's the anthropologist and the political scientist, and I'm the food person. My professor, who ran the program at the time, looks up at me. She had just gotten an email. We were on break, and she said, oh, you're a food person. You might be really interested in this. And I peek over her shoulder at her laptop, and it's an email that's come in from the Julia Child Foundation saying, Judith Jones has just retired from Knopp. We recognize that time is of the essence. She's 88 years old at this point. We want to know how to do an oral history of her. Can you help us? And I literally memorized the email address, fired off an email to them after class, said, I'll do anything to be involved with this project. I had read her memoir, which came out in 2007, The 10th Muse, My Life in Food. I knew nothing about her before encountering that memoir. I picked it up off a bookstore table when I was in college still, and quickly realized she had edited everyone that mattered to me in the world of food. I mean, she was at the center of all of it. So I just wanted to be near her in any capacity. they ended up handing me the reins to the project as long as we met and got along. So I went to her apartment in January of 2013.
Where was she living at the time?
Upper East Side, in the same building where she was born.
Right.
One of those kinds of New York families had moved away and then came back.
What's the kitchen like when you walk in?
Oh my God. In my mind, just a perfect kitchen, like a perfect square, bright yellow walls, totally unfussy, big industrial stove that like hardly fits in the room, right? Yep. All the cookware is hung on pegboard a la Julia Child on the walls, really like beaten up cutting boards, just practicals. She's got her spices in old peanut butter jars lined up along the wall just so she can get at everything,
And
right?
we see hints of this in the show, the HBO Max show that was on. We see a little bit of her apartment in there, don't we? Sometimes a little bit?
That's actually, I don't know if we do, and it's definitely not accurate. I can tell you that there's not a fancy appliance in that room. Yeah. And she was also a little bit of a Luddite doing things the hard way. So you didn't see gadgetry in her kitchen at all. Couple of sharp knives, good cutting boards, big industrial stove, done.
Wow. So you meet with her in 2013. What's that meeting like?
She offers, her dog rips a hole in my sweater as I walk in. I had been so nervous. It was a freezing cold January day. My palms are sweating. I'm shaking. So, my hero, right? She's tiny though. She's like 5 feet and maybe 100 pounds soaking wet. Her dog rips a hole in my sweater and she erupts into laughter. And I'm like, oh, you're funny and you're mischievous. Like I was completely disarmed instantly.
Oh, that's good.
She takes me into this beautiful kitchen and she makes a pot of tea. She pulls a tin of homemade cookies out of this old linen closet she had long since repurposed as her pantry because it's a New York apartment, right? And we go sit in her living room and we talked about leftovers and traveling. And she asked what I wanted to do with my life. Classic editor, right? She's drawing me out from the jump. And at the end of the hour, she said, okay, I'll work with you.
I love it. She said right on the way out, right, that she wanted to work with you and tell you more.
Yeah.
And so how does this relationship evolve with Judith Jones?
So that spring and summer, this is all 2013, we meet in her apartment in New York. Every time we meet, she insists we cook lunch first. So we had this sort of courtship in a way together. That recorder isn't running at that point. That's just us hanging out. Never, this is the queen of cookbooks. We never pulled a cookbook off her shelf. Everything is being done by feel. We're sort of learning how to dance together and figuring each other out. It felt like foreplay in a way, honestly. And then we'd sit down and eat, we'd have coffee, and then we'd go do our interviews. So we had all this time together to get to know one another before we ever hit
Which
record.
is probably a little bit of a flip because she probably did that a lot with her authors because I would imagine at that time, part of the relationship between an author and an editor is getting to know you in a spiritual way. I mean, now it's less common because there's more books and less time, but back then, likely, she's like wanting to hang out with Madhur Jaffrey, right?
Absolutely. And she, by the time I met her and when we started working together, she had just turned 89 years old in March of 2013. It just would have been her 100th birthday this month, actually, which is really amazing, March 10th. By this point, she's 89 years old, but she's a consummate student. She's like the epitome of a lifelong learner. She wants to learn from her authors. That's part of the reason she stayed engaged in the business for so long, is she actually wants that input from the outside world, that kind of cosmopolitanism that a true editor, we think of like a true editor having. So we hang out all spring in New York, and then she goes to the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont every summer. She and her late husband, Evan, who's Dick Jones in the book, that's what she called him, so that's the name we have there. They bought a place there in 1980, this tiny little house on the side of a mountain, really remote. At 89 years old, she's still going by herself for the entire summer, just her and her dog. And she says, well, we're not done working together. Why don't you come up? So we spent a few days together up in Vermont that summer as well. And again, cooking, we're taking walks, we're swimming in our pond. And only some of that time is on record, but we're developing this rich relationship. And when the project's over, it goes off to the archive. I delivered my work and we remain friends. So we would meet every month or two. We'd have lunch together. We'd go for walks. She was often asking me to help her try to figure out email, which drove her completely crazy.
Was she asking you advice? Because I feel a good editor wants to know you're of a very different generation and she's wanting to know what the kids are thinking in a way.
She wasn't asking me for advice so much as she wanted to kind of get a read on. I was in my mid-20s at the time. Yeah. She really wanted to know what I was thinking about as a food person, as a woman, as a, in terms of politics, right? We're talking about a very different era in American politics, sort of right before we go over this tipping point. Where we find ourselves now. But she really wanted to understand a youthful perspective. But at that point in her life, she was very sure of who she was. She didn't need any advice.
That's really, so this friendship happens and you write the oral history, which is an academic work. the story doesn't end there, because I know you worked on a couple projects that led to The Editor, which is the book you've just released. Tell me, how did your scholarship around Judith Jones continue?
Yeah, so I ended up writing my doctoral dissertation about her. Please, no one ever rated it as bone dry and totally uninteresting, and you can't find it anywhere. I move upstate in the fall of 2016. Our relationship thins out a little bit. I'm much farther away. I was also pregnant with my twins, who are 7.5 now at the time. So I'm going through this big transition, and she's also developed Alzheimer's. And I know this at this point. So we're seeing a little bit less of each other. I see her for the last time in the spring of 2017. I get to share pictures of my kids with her at the time, which is really special. She and I had bonded over both struggling with infertility, which is one of our deeply personal bonds. She dies in August of 2017, and I get an email from her stepdaughter, who I'd met a couple of times over the course of our relationship, saying, "Would you like to come to the Friends and Family memorial service in Vermont?" I said, "Of course, I'd be honored." So I go up, and when the service ends, Bronwyn, Judith's stepdaughter, pulls me aside and says, "Sarah, there are 2 rooms full of Judith's and my father's papers in the apartment. I know you've written a little bit about her. I'd written a couple articles at the time. Would you like to come take a look and maybe, help me think about what we might do with this?" And I said, "Yeah, of course.
Wow.
You can't turn away from something like that." And so November of 2017, we got together, and I walk into this portion of the apartment that I had never been in before. And there are literally 2 rooms, bookshelves, boxes, file cabinets stacked on top of a bathtub with plywood laid across it, full of manuscripts, letters, galleys, everything dating back to the 1930s.
Wow. And this is, pre-G Drive. So this is the way that editors worked. I can't imagine as an editor having to deal with paper the way she did, but clearly there's an archive there. And let me ask you, let's step back a bit. You've said a bit really well about, your relationship with Judith and your access to the papers. But let's go back to the Diary of Anne Frank, because I feel that's the mythology of Judith Jones, is that she pulled it off a pile. Now let's set the record for our listeners. What happened with her discovery of this manuscript? And then, of course, after the publication of it, was one of the most read diaries, I would say, probably ever. I mean,
it is still considered a publishing phenomenon.
Yeah.
I mean, truly, the Diary of Anne Frank is one of those books that's been published in pretty much every language and is still, in print all over the world. It's an incredible, incredible story. So Judith Jones had been working at Doubleday after she graduated from Bennington College in the late 1940s. And she was wrapped up in a really complicated love affair with this poet, Theodore Redke, who had been her professor at Bennington. They fell in love. He was struggling with manic depression. He also became her author at Doubleday, and she kind of needed out. She was getting really burned on the misogyny of publishing in the late 1940s. All the soldiers had come back, and she had gone from being an editor in her own right to kind of being a secretary, in effect, and she wanted to do more. Judith was born hungry. She was curious. She was ambitious. So she asks for a leave of absence, and she goes with her cousin, who was going on her honeymoon, to Paris. It was supposed to be a 3-week trip. She takes friend with her too. She ends up staying for 3 years. She meets the man who became her husband. And she was in between jobs. Several things had sort of fizzled out for her. It's the post-war years. Everything's chaotic and tumultuous, but it's also this time of artistic flourishing in post-war Europe. And Doubleday decides to set up a Parisian outpost. And so the editor-in-chief, Ken McCormick, comes over to Paris with his second-in-command, this guy Frank McCormick, who had just come out of the army. Frank is going to be appointed the sort of point person there, but he needs a secretary. And so Ken McCormick, who had been Judith's boss in New York, says, well, we already know this woman, Judith, and she knows the business, she knows the company. I'm going to set up this arranged marriage. Frank, Judith, Frank, please work together. So she gets hired at this new office of Doubleday in 1950 in Paris. Frank Price is a character. He's flitting off. He's mostly sort of handling the social calendar of American authors that are passing through Europe. And he's doing a little bit of acquiring European talent as well for Doubleday, which at the time was the biggest publishing house in the world. Yeah. Big deal. Judith, meanwhile, sets up her own literary agency on Doubleday's dime. So every time her boss goes out for lunch, she's conducting her own business.
That's incredible. What a great little nugget about her ingenuity and just drive.
Totally
Absolutely.
reflective of her moxie and chutzpah. I mean, this is Judith through and through. So whenever he's out, she sort of code switches, goes over to doing her own business. She's trying to sell some work.
Around the world of publishing, but she's not selling to Doubleday because she's would be self-selling, but she's taking it outside of the company.
That's right.
Genius.
She's got her own masthead. I mean, it's just like she prints up her own stationery. It's really incredible. But she's using their paper, their typewriters, their ink, their phone lines, all of it. So she's totally double dipping here. And one of the things that her boss, Frank Price, did say to her on this one wintry afternoon, he's got this big reject pile. He's already passed on these manuscripts. And he said, one of the things I need you to do today is write the rejection letters and send them out, please. And Judith is going through the pile and just sort of going through the motions. What's here? She's a curious person by nature. And she's totally captivated by the photograph of Anne Frank, the one we have all seen that's on the cover of her diary. She sees this photo of this girl and she takes it over, sits by the fire. It's in this big old rambling apartment in Paris. Her boss is out for a couple of hours and sits down to read. The book had already been published in French, and so she reads it in French. It's a galley copy, and she can't put it down.
So just to be clear, when she receives the galley, it was already out in the public market, but in France and very small market in the global scale, and certainly not English, which was the dominant.
About to come out in French, and I believe this
about to come out,
and I believe this is right on the eve of coming out in German too, which was a big deal, right? Obviously dealing with the subject here. So Doubleday has already officially passed on this manuscript, but no letter has been sent out. Judith reads it in one sitting. To her account, she is moved to tears and also is like, this is incredible. This young woman has this singular voice. And also, this is a testimony from a part of history that at the time hadn't been
historicized.
It's
5 years since the liberation of the camps.
That's right. You're still talking about major Holocaust denial, right? So this is a testimony from a young girl, really unique perspective. And when her boss gets back to the office that afternoon, Judith stands up and says, we've got to publish this book. And he sort of looks at her like, what, that book by that kid? This is Judith telling it she was a teenager when the diary was written. And Judith says, yeah. And he sort of grumbles and laughs a little bit, but he promises he'll take another look. And he does indeed. And he, in fact, ends up sending it back to New York and saying, you know what, on second thought, I think maybe we should publish this thing.
Wow.
Judith never gets any credit for this. So, in fact, Doubleday does publish The Diary of Anne Frank, 1952. It comes out. It is a phenomenon. There's a rave written in the New York Times. It goes into second and third printing almost immediately. When Judith returns to the United States in the early 50s, right on the heels of the publication, she needs a job. And she goes to Doubleday in New York and says, hey, how about a job? I was a big part of this incredible book. They won't hire her again. And so she turns her back on Doubleday forever. And 5 years later, she gets herself a job at Knopf, and the rest is history.
The rest is history. And she ended up working in the building we're recording this in at 1745 Broadway. Her last office was here at Knopf. And really, this conversation could go in so many directions. But I think we need to land the plane in the food world, because I think that is our greatest legacy. But the Anne Frank story is remarkable, and there's plenty of other. You had set it up, John Hershey for one. I mean, all the different authors she published. But when does she realize that food and cookbooks is a category or a section that she wants to really work in?
So she had learned how to cook during her time in Paris. She learned from her first lover there, who was a Frenchman, and in this tiny little Parisian closet of a kitchen. That's actually how she learned. So it's not from cookbooks. When she comes back to the States, she's married. She and her husband are both interested in food, but they find that they can't replicate what they had eaten in Paris here for two reasons. One is the quality of food in supermarkets at the time. This is the era of kind of mass supermarkets, things getting packaged are really beginning. She's used to shopping in these in the markets and the little shops.
Like the mid to late 50s was truly the worst time in American foodways.
Right.
I mean, you could say maybe now it's pretty bad, but back then it was pretty bad.
Yeah, height of processed food, sort of semi-homemade package. She's just devastated, right? They've just come from Paris. They both love to eat and cook, and they just can't do what they were doing in Paris. And so Judith starts looking for a French cookbook that can help guide her to continue her journey of learning how to prepare French food and to do it in the American context. There's nothing of the sort. So she starts at Knopf in 1957. 1959, one of the top brass at Knopf at the time, William Koshland, drops this huge manuscript on her desk. And it's written by these three unknown authors, Julia Child, Louisette Bertol, and Simca Beck. Simone Beck, excuse me, is her full name. And says, will you take a look? I know you lived in Paris. I know you like to cook. Can you just sort of flip through this?
Flip through it. Ha.
Yeah, exactly. So Judith sort of lights up and she takes it home in pieces and she starts cooking from it with her husband. They start making dinner from it. And famously, the first dish that she made was the boeuf bourguignon.
Yeah.
And she is blown away. The detail of the recipes, the thoroughness of the descriptions, and also the fact that it allowed for her to use ingredients that she could find in the U.S., right? That it's not written for someone living in France in English. It's written for someone living in the U.S. in English.
It was such an unlock there for Julia Child's legacy and her co-collaborators for that first book was the actual accessibility to it. I'm glad you brought that up because it isn't like a tome to French cooking. It's American cooking with a French vocabulary and vernacular.
Yeah, absolutely. So Judith quickly decides she really wants to work on this book, but she's only 2 years in at Knopf. She's technically an assistant to Blanche Knopf still, who is one of the two founders of Knopf. And no one at Knopf wants to publish cookbooks. It's beneath them. They're the most esteemed literary publishing house in New York. And so Judith knows she's going to have to get really creative if she wants to be able to work on this book. And so she sort of sidles up to this guy, Angus Cameron, who is a big deal in publishing at the time, an editor at Knopf. And he is a real bon vivant. He's a gourmand. He loves to cook. He's an outdoorsman. He hunts. And they had become really good friends. And so she says to him, will you look at this? I think it's amazing, but I need to know if you think that I'm right. And he takes a look, he cooks a couple of recipes from it too, and he comes back to her and he says, you're absolutely right. I've never seen anything like this. She's not even allowed to pitch it in an editorial meeting. And so Angus Cameron goes and pitches it on her behalf.
Second time. This is such a refrain about the way Judith is being treated in this industry.
That's right. She wasn't even allowed in the door of the meeting. She was too young and she was too female. Mm-hmm. So she's got a guy do it on her behalf. And lo and behold, the Knopfs, Alfred and Blanche Knopf, are sort of famously at odds with one another. And Blanche Knopf, who Judith is working for at the time, is like, I'm not giving my assistant up to some cookbook. And Alfred Knopf, who loves to stick it to his wife, sort of says, well, you know what? Let's give Mrs. Jones her chance. This is the line as Judith tells it. And she's waiting nervously outside the meeting. And Angus Cameron comes out and says, we got it. They're going to let you do it. And so she signs the cookbook, and they spend a year and a half revising the book from, they strip it back to the studs, basically. Yeah. And Judith and Julia are writing letters across the Atlantic. Julia Child becomes the kind of point person for this 3-person writing team. And Judith is testing the recipes in the U.S. So Julia Child, as she revises the recipe, says, well, Judith, will you go see if they have this kind of mushroom in your supermarket? And if the answer is no, Julia Child revises the recipe again so that it includes an ingredient that you can find if you're living in New York or Des Moines, Iowa, or wherever. Mm-hmm. This is how Mastering the Art of French Cooking really gets made in the iteration that we all know and love, which is that it's one of the most workable, accessible French cookbooks in the English language.
And then television enters the fray.
1963, she goes on TV.
She goes on TV and it changes everything. She becomes the first celebrity chef. Her books become bestsellers instantly. Judith's career changes dramatically with this bestseller in the building. How does she kind of leverage this success from Julia and become the Judith Jones that we know her in the cookbook industry as acquiring some of the legends in the game? And I'd like to go over as many names as possible.
There's so many.
And I think it'd be great to give us a sense of who she edited and really becoming this force in the industry for decades. It's important to note, too, that as she grew, the industry of cookbooks grew as well. And it became a real opportunity for publishers to publish cookbooks with the advent of television and media really pushing these books, and the cooking show becoming a part of our Sunday afternoons and then later onto cable. Judith's there along the way, and it's a remarkable story you tell.
So after Mastering the Art of French Cooking comes out in 1961, Julia Child goes on TV in 1963 and really becomes a household name after that. But Judith is still trying to build a career for herself here at Knopf, right? She's still trying to prove herself to her colleagues who are intent on diminishing her importance to the house and really, what she can bring as an editor. So she's really building her literary career on the side. That's what gets her credibility in the house. Come late 60s, early 70s, things are starting to change. She's been at Knopf for a decade. She has more credibility. Blanche Knopf has died, so she's sort of been liberated to be an editor in her own right. And that's when you see her start to go after other cookbook projects that are some of the household names that we know now. So from the late 60s to the early 70s, we're talking about Claudia Roden, Mater Jaffrey, Anna Thomas. We get into the mid-70s and we have Edna Lewis, who's very, very close and dear to my own heart. Later, we get into Lydia Bastianich. We are talking about James Beard. I can't believe I forgot James Beard.
What a jump cut. Like the cinematic version of this, and there will be one, I'm sure. The jump cuts here of all these authors you're naming is pretty remarkable.
It's wild. It's the who's who. It's the Hall of Fame, basically.
It's the Hall of Fame of many. But, okay, what about... I'd love to hear like some of the smaller names that maybe we don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it depends what kind of circles you're running
Sure,
in.
of course.
So if
not to diminish anybody, but, James Beard is one name and then there's other names.
So in some ways, I think Anna Thomas has been forgotten a little bit. So The Vegetarian Epicure comes out in 1972. It's a big deal of a book. So vegetarian cooking in the kind of counterculture has taken hold by this point, but it's not in the mainstream. And it's thought of as kind of like dusty co-op stuff that doesn't taste very good, like wheatberry loaf. We're talking about that era of vegetarian cooking. The Vegetarian Epicure, judging by its title, right, is a book about pleasure. It's a book about enjoying your food. And the idea that vegetarianism is not asceticism. It's not about being good. It's about eating well. And Anna Thomas is a really interesting figure because she was a film student at UCLA at the time. She's totally steeped in protest politics. So that book is really reflective of a kind of changing and very youthful side of American food culture that you begin to see reflected around that time in the New York Times food column. Craig Claiborne at the helm at the time, very, very close friend of Judith Jones. So I think Anna Thomas is really important. Until a few years ago, Edna Lewis would have been a name that a lot of people didn't know. Thank goodness that's really begun to change because she deserves all the credit she gets and then some. Really important figure in American cooking. But The Taste of Country Cooking, which was the first book she did with Judith Jones, came out in 1976, America's bicentennial year. Really, it's a corrective of Black history. It's also one of the first examples we have of a woman who grew up in that sort of cross-section of American culture in rural Virginia, which is about the legacy of enslavement, also about indigenous culture, and also about the sort of Jeffersonian ideals in French cooking. She's talking about a vernacular American cuisine that really paves the pathway for the popularity of Southern cuisine that we saw in the early 2000s, right? But we didn't see that kind of credit being given to her until just a few years.
We had Paula Deen, as we were talking about, which is your
Yeah,
reference
that's
point,
right.
which
Yeah.
is a
We
very
won't go there.
problematic history.
Maybe let's not.
No, let's not put that name in there. But I think to your point, that it is a corrective. And I love that you use that word when talking about Edna Lewis, because I feel it still needs to be said how important that work is. And Judith, as the editor, is shepherding the project. How was that received within the building? I mean, a Black chef at that era, you think about, that's a pioneering moment for obviously Edna, but also for the publishing house and the publishing industry. How did she get it made? Judith.
Yeah. So Edna Lewis had been working with a co-writer on her first cookbook. Edna Lewis was working primarily as a caterer at the time. That was how she was making a living for herself, cooking for really wealthy white people here in Manhattan, all of whom thought her food was amazing. I mean, she was a celebrated chef, but she was barely scraping by. Judith came to know her because when that first book was on its way to the printer, it was called the Edna Lewis Cookbook. The co-writer, Evangeline Peterson, knew someone at Knopf and said, can you help us maybe figure out how to publicize this book? We're dealing with an unknown author here. And so that person said, well, you should talk to Judith Jones. She was always the cookbook person in the room, right? Judith invited them in to meet, and she said, well, there's nothing I can do for you. It's not my book, and your book's on the way to its printer. It's not like I can help you edit the thing. But as they began talking, and she got to hear a little bit about Edna Lewis and her upbringing, again, consummate editor, she's always drawing people out. She sort of said, I think there's something here. And Evangeline Peterson, the co-writer, said, well, in fact, we're already thinking towards a second book, which is much more about Edna Lewis's childhood, the place she grew up, Freetown, Virginia, which was a town that had been settled by formerly enslaved people, including Edna Lewis's grandparents. And Judith signed the book almost immediately. She was totally entranced by the storytelling. It was a book about communal living. It was a very anti-capitalist book in a lot of ways. It was a book about sustainable agriculture, about history, about an abundance of food and pleasure in Black culture. It was about a kind of Southern cooking that really hadn't been talked about or written about much. And after a couple of years, this was a different time in publishing. Book deals often played out over a longer period of time. Judith and the co-writer decided that the co-writer was kind of getting in the way of Edna Lewis's very, very unique voice. And so Judith ended up working much more as collaborator on that book, almost co-writer, much more than editor. And they too, Edna Lewis and Judith Jones, worked back and forth in person and also in letters, gathering material. Edna Lewis went home to Virginia several times over that period of a couple of years, gathering historical research, cooking with her siblings, going out into the woods and the farm fields and sort of writing back to Judith saying, this is what I'm seeing, feeling, tasting, remembering. And all of that gets worked into the DNA.
I love that you mentioned when an editor and a writer become co-conspirators, co-collaborators. It does happen now. I think there are some editors, some in this building, some in other buildings, that take that approach, more of a hands-on approach. There's many editors who do not. And she didn't get credit for it, though. I mean, this is Edna Lewis's book, and a good editor doesn't need the credit.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, they're shaping from the wings, right?
Yeah.
And their job is really to help an author hone their voice, find their voice, and hone their voice.
Let's talk about money a little bit, because as an acquiring editor, you offer the advance, and then you obviously want to sell more copies to cover that advance. Was she a hit maker? Was Judith Jones somebody who had a taste that kind of translated to commercial success? And also, I just have to ask your research. I mean, every editor has bombs. Did Judith have any remarkable bombs? And this is obviously respect to everyone involved, but not everything commercially works.
Yeah. In terms of hits in the culinary realm, really, Julia Child was the one.
Yeah.
She was a huge cash cow for Knopf, and she continued to publish with Knopf
to this day,
the end of her life.
This
right?
day is making money for Knopf. Come on,
yeah, that's right. That's right. So we're talking about decades, and by the time Julia Child was in her old age, the advances were over $1 million. So we're talking big money, right? But also huge sales, huge sales. Global celebrity, Julia Child, by the 1970s. And then she continues to go on to publish until her death. In terms of other hits, no is the answer, not in terms of sales. So what you see is a woman who was working really slowly and steadily at a different time and with a different sense of time. She was hell-bent on integrity. She did not fall for or follow trends. She was not working with chefs. She really had an aversion to chef cookbooks because she felt like they didn't work for or apply to home cooks. She had tried a couple and they frustrated her, so she decided not to do them anymore. She did end up publishing Oprah and Rosie Daly's cookbook, which was a huge mega bestseller.
Can I just say, it was In the Kitchen with Rosie?
That's
the name
right.
of it? And I remember it was 1996 or 1995. There's a recipe for a vegetarian chopped liver from that book that we would make as a family.
No way.
I vividly remember that book.
You are the only person I've ever talked to who knows anything about that book.
Oh, that book sold, I would say, millions. Yeah, 5 million copies, maybe.
Millions of copies. So, along the way, she'd find a way to sort of throw Knopf a bone and make them a bunch of money. Remember, she is editing John Updike and Ann Tyler throughout all this.
Yeah, this
so
is
some of
great
the best-selling fiction authors in America, right? So she's making them plenty of money. But the cookbooks on the side are kind of her play money. She's not being given the resources to make cookbooks. She is regularly not allocated any budget for recipe testing. And so she famously did a lot of it with her cookbook authors. She acted as tester with them, which is incredible. Think about, as an editor, the knowledge you gain, having that kind of intimate knowledge of your author's process, actually being in the kitchen with them while they cook, taking notes, asking questions, which is part of the reason why some of her authors that stayed with her book after book loved her. She was so embedded in the process. She was so invested.
It reminds us about Maria Gonochelli's process as well, who also had that very hands-on approach. I would say today it's a much different business. I mean, acquisitions are more frequent, and editors don't have that kind of time. But that hands-on approach is remarkable. And I must say, this idea of an editor working with fiction and then crossing over and doing cookbooks. There's only one editor I know at Random House who does it, and Cleo, she's amazing, and she's a young editor, and when I talk to her about this process, I just don't understand how you can do both.
I think it really
remarkable.
enriched her process.
Probably.
And poetry too, right? So poetry was a great love of Judith's, and she edited poetry all throughout her career. I actually think poetry and cookbooks have a ton in common because
Sure.
it's about distilling, right? It's about getting clear. It's about cutting out all the extra language so you get to the heart of the thing. And it's also about sensuality, right? So if you think about poetry as really to evoke feeling, that's the same thing you're trying to do with a cookbook, right? Is you're trying to get someone who may have never seen or tasted a dish to be able to replicate it based on sensory language and cues in the recipe. So actually, the recipe and poems have a huge amount in common, and she's taking the lessons she's learning from each genre and applying them to the others.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. And I think with head notes in particular, too, there is a level of poetry in a good head note, expressing real deep, instructive information, but also having a real art to it if you want them to be readable.
It's got to be evocative, right? You want someone to want to cook that recipe.
Sell the recipe
That's
in
right.
the head note.
That's
It's always like the number one note in any cookbook manuscript. You never answered my question about the bomb.
Bombs.
Is there like a bomb? I mean, there's got to be some bombs.
Yeah, the one that comes to mind. So Judith, in the late 90s, started working on a series called Knopf Cooks American, which is very little known and really paved the pathway for kind of the regional American cooking that we see all over both the restaurant world and the cookbook world now. And she thought there was a really interesting story to be told about American vernacular cooking, about the influence of all kinds of immigrant cultures, indigenous cultures. And she wanted to do it as a series. It was a hugely ambitious project. By and large, it flopped. So I think it's an example we have of both Judith trying to move a little too fast, a little too quickly with a really ambitious project, almost 20 books in that series that come out in the span of a couple of years.
Was it like these Knopf Cooks America, were these just packaging for single topic books, or like how does that work?
These are original cookbooks. So most of how it went, Judith Jones's husband had been reporting for Gourmet at the time, doing a column on American cooking, and they would travel together. And he was an amazing reporter. She'd go with him sometimes. And he would, talk to everyone as a reporter does. He's going to church cookouts. He's going to barbecues. He's going to pancake dinners at the local firehouses so he can meet folks. And occasionally, Judith will find someone in that milieu that she feels like can really nail a cookbook. And she starts working with them. So she's commissioning these books one by one to talk about regional American food, the difference in ingredients, the difference in climates, the kind of cooking techniques and restaurant cultures that have evolved around the country.
Are they good books? I mean, it sounds like, they might have not worked commercially, but are they like good books?
I will say I think they're excellent. I have the whole collection. I really love them. They, in some ways, I think they work better as works of anthropology, but like all of Judith's books, the recipes work.
The recipes work, but anthropology, and as we know today, anthropology and cultural anthropology is much important as actually a recipe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's go to late career Judith Jones, and let's talk about her final 5 years working in the industry. I know she wrote a book about her dog. I have it in my office. My former colleague Anna Hazel ordered it once, and I think we did write a story about it at one point on Taste. But I mean that's cool and that's unique.
Let's go back. That one didn't sell real well. I'm gonna go ahead and be.
I think I looked at the numbers once and I was like,
really honest.
I was kind of like, this is what Judith Jones gets. This is like one of the gimmies.
Yeah. So
cooking for her dog. It was literally about that.
In 2007, her memoir, The 10th Muse, comes out, and it puts her on the map for a lot of people that hadn't known who she was at the time. Then the movie Julie and Julia comes out, and that is what really brings her into public knowledge, especially among food people, right? People go see the movie. She is totally caricatured in that movie. We can talk about that in a minute if you'd like. But it's her book, The Pleasures of Cooking for One, that comes out right around the time of her retirement that is actually an incredible cookbook. So she's 85 years old when this book comes out. She is still working full-time at Knopf. And it's this really remarkable book about sort of asserting your vitality and vivacity in old age, but also this, don't give up. You have a life still to live, and you deserve to enjoy it. She was really making a case for pleasure as a pursuit in its own right, which is a kind of countercultural messages in America in particular, especially for older women who we tend not to hear much from. And it's a really good cookbook.
Sarah, I think we wrote about that book. When I was
so good.
Yeah, that's the one we wrote about. Absolutely.
It's really useful whether you're cooking for yourself or, as I do, for a family, because really it's about working cooking into the rhythm of your days so that you don't become overwhelmed by big projects, but rather you're doing it bit by bit. So maybe leave some bones on to simmer on the back of the stove. Maybe you're repurposing parts of a roast chicken to make chicken salad, to make enchiladas, whatever. But she's sort of saying you can do this in ways that fit your life. And I actually feel like it laid the groundwork for a lot of the kind of food columns that we see now.
Yeah, I mean, she was definitely writing in an internet style before the web was part of food writing. And was there a final book that she edits that before her retirement? Is there like a last?
She worked with Lydia Bastianich right up until the end. And that was a remarkable friendship. They really loved each other. And Lydia Bastianich has said in many places, this is not news to anyone, but that Judith taught her how to write and was very beholden to her as her editor. But that was really the cookbook and the cookbook author that she was working with up until the very end. She did start to taper a little towards her final years here at Knopf. And when she hung up her hat in 2011, it was really, I think, because she felt like she had done all that she could do.
Let's talk about Judith in pop culture. You've mentioned Julie and Julia. We've mentioned the HBO show. Can the editor, your book, be adapted? Because I feel like the real story of Judith Jones, what you write about so brilliantly, needs to be told in either a documentary form, but also in a scripted form.
Here's hoping, Matt.
I mean, let's will this into. Have you been shopping it, as they say?
We are shopping it. Yeah. I think there's a tremendous story to be told, and it's about Judith, but it's also about women getting their foot into publishing. It's about the ways in which women in food have constantly and are still persistently pushed to the side in terms of being taken seriously in literary spaces. But also, it's this cast of characters, literary and culinary, that she's at the center of, right? She is a main character, but she's surrounded by interesting people who are carving out interesting, unconventional lives for themselves. Judith was really caricatured in Julie and Julia, and she went publicly on the record on her first book tour for the 10th Muse, basically saying to anyone who would listen, that is not me, and I did not agree to anything about that. So the famous scene is that she didn't show up to dinner at Julie Powell's apartment because of rain. Anyone who knew Judith Jones knows that rain did not stop that woman, nor did anything else. And Tyler actually went on record and said, you've got to be kidding me with this portrayal.
A little bit of a low blow there, but that's just Hollywood and scripts get doctored. So you have some meetings. Who plays Judith Jones?
Oh,
let's just do it.
Let's do
the casting. I know.
Pop culture, not my strong suit, Matt, but I just finished watching Lessons in Chemistry, and I've got to say she would play an amazing Judith.
I know.
You need someone who's got like the stature that makes you think it's got to be a Trojan horse, right? Who looks sort of diminutive, looks delicate, but is kind of this outsized personality and has the ability to play it. I think that's hard. I think maybe, though, it's Michelle Williams.
Oh, I love that. They look very, 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 very similar. It has a great striking resemblance. Just from
Producers, if you're listening. That's my vote. Michelle Williams, Judith Jones.
The actor who played her in Julia was good. I thought that was a pretty good. You're like absolutely not agreeing with me.
I mean, it's not Judith. The acting is good, but it's not Judith. She never had that haircut. Yeah. She didn't talk like that. She had this low, throaty, almost like Lauren Bacall style voice.
Oh, bad. So you're. I mean, sorry. This is a bad take by me. A weak ass take.
Yeah,
not a good portrayal.
The HBO Max series really portrays her as a sidekick, and she was never the sidekick.
I recall, I admittedly did not watch that much of that show, but I do recall a standoff in an amazing scene at Knopf that Judith faces down her editor. I thought that was pretty liberating in a way.
It just didn't happen that way. Good acting, good writing, but it's not true to form. This is one of those cases where the true story is more interesting than the fictional story.
I love that, Sarah. That is exactly when you go to LA to your waterball meetings, that's what you say. And as a fan of your work and of your book, I mean, let's make this happen. It's got to happen.
Yeah.
Sarah Franklin, this has been great. Thank you so much for joining This Is Taste.
Thanks, Matt.
This is Taste is hosted by Eliza Abarbanel and me, Matt Rodbar. The show is produced by Shalia Harris and Pat Stango and edited by Clayton Gumbert. Theme music by Steve Rydell. Visit Taste online at tastecooking.com and make sure to subscribe to our newsletter for updates on all cool things that are happening.